Welcome to the Student Learning Objectives for Mason City Schools. My name is Brian Geniusz.
And I'm Jamie Lusher.
We come to you from an experienced school district of Worthington City Schools who has already gone through a year's worth of student learning objectives and the Ohio Teacher Evaluation System to share our experiences with all of you of Mason City Schools.
Brian and I are very excited to share our lens of this process with you as teachers and as teacher leaders and as administrators. So what we'd like to do is, knowing that you come to us from a varied background and have varied experience and or background knowledge to this process, we want you to do a self-reflection and a formative assessment to let us know and to guide your learning in terms of where you are with your understanding of the student learning objective process as it pertains to the teacher evaluation system in the state of Ohio. So go ahead and do a self-assessment here. Are you at a place where you know what a student learning objective is? Okay, that knowledge level, that first step of Bloom's taxonomy. Are you at an application level? Could you apply it? Could you begin thinking about, I think I might like to write my student learning objective on this. I might use a common formative assessment I have here. Are you ready to start planning and acting? Maybe you're at that application level. Or maybe you're an expert. Maybe you've attended some of the state trainings. Maybe you've gone through the process in a former district or are leading that process in Mason City Schools. So you're at that creation level. You're at that most sophisticated level of Bloom's. Or perhaps you're at a place where you still have no idea what this process is or what it means to you. Maybe you're brand new to the field and this is something that you're going to have to do a lot of background knowledge building on. So take a moment and do a self-reflection, and we're going to move on. So the focus of our learning throughout this presentation will be first to build background knowledge of what the SLOs actually are and what that means for you. We're then going to give you a timeline and scope and sequence of what that process will look like and how it will unfold within your district at Mason City Schools. We're then going to share with you why, as a district, Worthington, with a student population of over 10,000 students, 19 school buildings, and a broad range of course offerings, chose vocabulary and building background knowledge as a universal strategy and focus for our student learning objective process, and why we found value in focusing specifically on this area of instruction, because it transcended all grade levels, all content areas in every one of our classrooms within the district. We're also going to show you examples of some of the student learning objective assessments that we use to help our teachers get an idea of what this could look like for them within their particular classroom. We're going to show you some exemplars, and we're going to show you some examples of the work that our teachers completed. And then finally, we're going to close out the presentation with discussion around the next steps for Mason, because this process will be unique to your district, unique to the needs of the teachers, and certainly unique to the needs of your student population. So it'll be important for you as a district to make some decisions and to use this as a source of collaboration, not as isolation when you look at this SLO process.
The Ohio Teacher Evaluation System is focused in on student growth. So what exactly is student growth? The Ohio Teacher Evaluation System simply says it's the change in student achievement between two scores. So we're going to use a student learning objective to show that growth to the Ohio Teacher Evaluation System. The SLO is basically a goal that can show that a teacher has had an impact upon student learning. It has to be measurable, and it's a long-term goal that was written by a team of teachers. So where does all this come from? You can see the Ohio Revised Code. You can search it online. Basically, the long story is, boom, it's state law. Know that because it's state law, that state laws do change, and they go into committee and get budget changes and things of that nature. So what Jamie and I are describing to you today is where the state law is at this time. It could change or it could stay the same, but please be aware this is where we are right now.
Okay, so why student learning objectives? Well, first, there are many potential benefits by using a long-term measurable goal of student growth. And for many years, districts like Mason and other similar likes have used things like common formative assessments to make sure that all students are making growth and we're meeting the needs of every unique and individual child. So a couple of things to think about. SLOs can reinforce best teaching practice. That is, in fact, why we picked vocabulary and background knowledge in Worthington. SLOs are meant to be fluid and malleable, so they're meant to be developed to meet the needs of individual learners and to support that growth for every child. That process being fluid gives the teacher a lot of autonomy to make decisions that ultimately will impact student achievement and student growth within their classroom. Student learning objectives, as we've outlined, are teacher-directed and teacher-created. This is very different than the state value-added or AYP data that our other teachers that are in grades 4 through 8 will be looking at as a part of their student growth indicator as a part of the evaluation systems. This is a very different process where teachers have a lot more autonomy and a lot more investment into what that looks like within their classroom and ultimately for students. SLOs also value the expertise of teachers and the skills that they bring into instruction and assessment. So by allowing teachers to develop and create these assessments and to monitor student growth, we're really honoring that process of the teacher knowing those students and knowing exactly where they come and where they want to get them by the end of the year or that instructional period. And then what we thought was so valuable was this potential for collaboration. Our district, again, has 19 buildings, and again, it's very difficult to have those grade level or content-specific teams across the district. Mason's in a very unique and what I believe a very wonderful opportunity for collaboration because you do have a campus setting. So you can collaborate by grade level or by department or by team readily, and that's going to be a great process for you. So I would say that the potential for collaboration is intact for Mason, and that you as departments and grade level teams are already set up in an infrastructure that will allow you to develop high quality assessments and really have great collaboration around this process, which will really support your confidence. And I think it's going to support a better outcome for you and ultimately for your students and their learning. Just to review, we are talking about the student growth measure portion of this Ohio teacher evaluation system, and you can see the red blinking, I guess that would be an ellipse that's around this area. At this time, the state has 50% of a teacher's overall or composite performance based on the student growth measure. Now, it is important to note that currently there is a bill that has not been passed into law that might change this percentage. So keep your eye on this. But at this time, it is 50% though. So 50% of the student growth measure, whether it is an SLO or data that teachers have, will be will comprise the overall criteria used to determine where a teacher is rated, either as accomplished, skilled, and that says proficient, but that language has changed to skilled, developing, or ineffective. So you can see where this resides and ultimately what the focus of our presentation is. So we're going to focus specifically or germane to the student growth measure for this presentation. I want to talk a little bit about the evaluation matrix. So obviously, you saw the slide before where 50% of your overall rating would be the student growth measure and 50% would be your principal evaluations, your walkthrough, the observations and all that process that you spend with your administrator or the people that are credentialed in your district to provide the evaluation process to teachers. I want to show you here though, as you look at this chart, you will notice that even though the matrix is said to be 50-50, it's actually weighted. And the student growth measure really does impact the overall rating at more of a level than the actual observations of the principal. So you will notice that if a teacher is accomplished in the student growth measure and is ineffective with their teacher performance, they still receive a skilled. But transversely, if a teacher is ineffective with their student growth measure, you'll see that the repercussions there are quite different and that they are still either developing or below as a result of that. So be mindful of that and take a look at that evaluation matrix because that is something to notice and be mindful of.
With this great emphasis on the student growth measures, it's important that you understand how to collect the best baseline and trend data for your students. This basically summarizes where your students start out your academic year, where they're strong, where they're weak, and also possibly some trend data that'll allow you to make appropriate instructional decisions along the way. You're also going to include on your SLO forms some background demographic data, the students' names, their course name, grade level. You also would include at this point some information about how many students are on IEPs, LEPs, or other identified populations. During the interval, you're going to continue to have good quality instruction, and it's going to take some time. A lot of our teachers in Worthington have used this opportunity to actually formatively assess students' progress on these student learning objectives. So these durations, just an end and start date. So make certain that they are concrete and you know when that timeline occurs.
One thing to mention with the interval is that we stress with our teachers that you want to maximize the absolute amount of time that you have with students. So you want to try to assess your students as close to the beginning of the year as possible, and you want to be able to maximize the instructional block or time that you have to demonstrate growth. So you want to be mindful of that. So you wouldn't want to wait 6 weeks if you start school August 15th until September 30th to start assessing your students, because you've lost 6 weeks of time where you could demonstrate growth. So we really stress with that interval maximizing the amount of time that students would be exposed to your instruction. Also, it's really important that, and this seems kind of like a no-brainer, but your SLOs need to be directly aligned with the new learning standards and your content. So when you sit down with your principal, you should be able to specifically show where your SLO links, or there's a nexus to the content, the skills, and specific standards that you teach. They should be broad enough to represent the greater good there, but then also be narrow enough that you can measure that. All right, so think very closely about that piece of this, because it seems like it would be very obvious, but for some of our folks, as we went through the process and vetted their assessments, it was really obvious that they hadn't given a lot of thought to what the standard was actually asking of them. Also, as you think about the assessments, you want to make sure that you're going to be able to demonstrate student growth for the objective with which you've set, all right? So they need to be aligned. Your assessment needs to be aligned with the objective that you've set, and there needs to be a connection between that objective, the assessment, and ultimately the standards that you're using to guide your instruction.
The SLO is basically going to be evaluated on how many of your students made their growth targets. So it's a key point to make certain you set the growth targets at an appropriate level, which should be rigorous yet attainable. This is one of the largest challenges our teachers had faced during the 2013-14 school year. We have no background information about where to set these targets. We're using different types of assessments, and it was somewhat a blind setting of these targets. So we'll go over that a little bit further on in our presentation, but please understand that this is a very key point. Some of the districts we've been in contact with around Central Ohio have set and used what they call a gap closing formula. Others have used straight formulas, more linear in measurements. However, there's no one single correct answer for how to set these growth targets for your students.
All right, so moving away from the data piece, now it's that the important piece, the conversation around, or the rationale around why you would set a growth target the way that you have. So when you have conversations as a part of this process with your principals, or you're having those discussions with your department or grade level team, it's important to have thought through why it is you set that target the way that you have. If you've set different targets for students, then making sure that you have data to support why you've set those the way that you have, and then certainly drawing upon the baseline and trend data that you have for your student outcomes, because that's really critical. As Brian outlined, this was a really challenging component of this process for our teachers, in particular because there's not a way to calibrate this. You know, teacher A in one classroom could set a very high bar based on her students. Teacher B could set a much lower or less rigorous bar, and then you have a situation where one teacher is coming out with a skilled growth piece, and then you have one teacher who's coming out with an accomplished growth rating, and you know the rigor is different. So there's not a great way to calibrate this, and the state hasn't provided that. So my point here is that your rationale, your discussion, your process will support the quality and the inter-rater reliability of those assessments. It's going to be very important that you have those discussions and you think deeply about why it is you're setting the growth target the way that you are for your class or identified group of students. So let's talk a little bit about that. Well, first you want to set that growth target based on your baseline data or your trend data, okay? That's really critical. So when you pre-assess students, looking at how they performed on the assessment. I will tell you we had some teachers that set the bar too low, and when they did their pre-assessment, all the students were beyond what they would have thought the grade level benchmark would meet. That was great information, but guess what they had to do? They had to increase the rigor of the assessment because they weren't going to be able to demonstrate growth. On the other side of that, we had some teachers who administered an assessment and the kids bombed it. And so they had to make some adjustments because they wanted to make sure that they were able to demonstrate growth, but they had to make sure that kids were on the map at least, or on the road to making that growth. There should be specific indicators of growth that demonstrate the increase in learning between 2 points in time, and that's what Brian alluded to. So when you have that interval of time, whether it's a semester-long course that you have to identify or it's the year-long course, being able to demonstrate that growth quantitatively is going to be very critical so that you can achieve the highest mark possible. We also, talked with our teachers about tiering those assessments and those growth targets whenever possible. If you have students that their baseline data shows that they're at the very beginning or emerging stages of learning in that grade level or course, then you're going to want to make sure you set a growth target that's realistic for them and tiered. Okay? If you have students that are exceeding the grade level benchmark, then you're going to have to set a different growth target for those students as well. And I think that piece there of making sure that you're setting it so that developmentally it is appropriate for those students. And I will tell you, this was an area that was very challenging and demanding for our teachers.
These growth targets need to show growth for all of your students, and they should be rigorous yet attainable and articulate a specific minimum expected performance. Please make certain also that your growth targets are attainable by April 30th, which is the end date for student growth measure data to be collected and submitted to the Ohio Teacher Evaluation System online. So we had an incident here in Worthington where some of our teachers wrote growth targets to reflect instruction that would occur after April 30th and had to modify that assessment. So please make certain that all the growth targets are accomplishable by the end of the growth period.
And I think one thing that's very important too, as Brian alluded to, teachers had planned and earnestly thought about the content they would cover. And remember that, every group of students is different and they mature differently and they develop differently. And so what you think you might get to in August or in April, you may not have gotten to for the remainder of the school year. And that was exactly what happened with the new content, new standards, new resources. We had some math teachers that had identified vocabulary terms that they had, planned on instructing and assessing as a part of their year. And what happened, in fact, is they did not hit that mark. And as a result, we had to have some discussion around, are we able to modify and change the assessment? And that's a very slippery slope because the perception could be that we were changing an assessment because the students wouldn't have demonstrated the amount of growth that was reflective of the teacher's instruction. But from the outside point of view, it would look as though we were trying to kind of stack the deck for those teachers when that was not at all what we were doing. The thought was we'd adjust the assessment because we didn't cover that content. So we had a lot of discussion in that area. So that is something to be very mindful of. Make for sure that you are going to be able to hit all of the items that you have planned for as a part of that assessment. Do not overplan and do not pull in things that you're not sure you're going to cover, because after you make those decisions, it's really hard to go back and try to, make a fluid process out of something that really is kind of set in stone at this point.
We also chose the image of a young lady trying to hit a piñata as an idea of growth, as a metaphor for setting growth targets. Your first time, you're a little bit blindfolded as to where the target actually is. But after each subsequent attempt, you'll gather more information and be better suited to set better and better growth targets for your students. Okay,
so here you just see an overview of what we've put together in terms of the scope and sequence of the process as you think about these student learning objectives as a year-long process for your department, your grade level team, and for your district. So first, let's look at where we are today. Back in March, Brian and I had the pleasure of being face-to-face with a great number of your teachers who, on their own time, chose to come hear about the exciting SLO process. So we're grateful and humble to their willingness to come and listen to us. We are now, providing information and the audio to that presentation, which we will again present on June 6, 2014. Now, your district, in collaboration with Gail and Amy, are talking through what the collaboration will look like around this process for you. But one thing is very clear is that they are going to make sure that the process really resonates on this idea that teachers collaborate and work together as grade levels or grade level teams or departments to develop the most collaborative process to develop these assessments. So you'll create test items, you'll develop common formative assessments, is my understanding, and that vocabulary in these assessments would be found in your curriculum formats that are already created, and that's the same process that we used in Worthington. We had developed new curriculum formats, K-12, to align with the new learning standards. So we had already identified vocabulary, and that's exactly where our teachers started. A couple of things to be mindful of. First, you will collaborate to determine the items that you would put in either your pre and your post assessments for the SLO process. I think it's important to mention those teachers that sit in what we consider a support service role. For a teacher who has a general classroom of, let's say, third grade, she's got colleagues that teach just third grade. So to create a common form of assessment is a much cleaner model for those types of teachers. For our teachers that are English language learning specialists, intervention specialists, reading recovery teachers, those types of folks, it becomes a little more challenging because they sit in a role where they are following a group of students and providing a level of service that is not part of necessarily the general curriculum. So it makes the collaboration a little more challenging. So one of the things that we really focused on was, well, what network or what framework could we create to allow those teachers to collaborate? So there are a couple of models. The first could be that your English language learning teachers collaborate to scaffold and develop an assessment for their particular special area. We felt a better model, though, was for those teachers to push in and collaborate with the grade level teams that they support. So if I'm an intervention specialist and I have 3 kiddos that are in a 4th grade classroom, pushing in that 4th grade classroom and working closely with that 4th grade team on their English language arts vocabulary assessment or their math assessment or whatever they've developed to really create a collaborative model around this process so that those support service teachers do not feel like they're on an island by themselves because their number of students are much more reduced. So they have to be very mindful that they want to increase and kind of create what we said, cast a broad net around their students because they're going to have a very reduced number of students on their caseload. So this is something we can talk more about later, but I want you to be mindful that those teachers that sit in support service areas have what we consider to be a much messier approach to the SLO because, again, they don't have a particular group of students over the course of the year. For example, a reading recovery teacher might graduate out 4 or 5 students over the course of the year. So to be able to demonstrate that interval instruction can be very challenging for those teachers. So that is something we had to work with on a unique and individual basis with those teachers and as a part of our workshopping process. And again, this just reiterates here in terms of the reducing of items, how to scaffold those assessments and what that might look like if you're an ELL specialist or an intervention specialist, as you think about what your students' growth targets might look like and how you might scaffold those assessments. Okay, so after you pre-assess the students, you will bring those results to your principal and you'll have discussion. You'll talk about the rationale for your growth target that you're thinking about. You will talk about goal setting. You will look closely at how the students responded to the assessment. And you will set your timeline and your goals for the post-assessment. And that needs to be completed by September 30th with your principal. Now, if you're a principal and you're listening to this, your head's probably about ready to, it's just probably already pounding with a headache because you're thinking about how am I going to individually conference with every single teacher in my building. Well, one of the things that's fabulous about being able to collaborate as a grade level team or a department team is that you can meet as a team with your principal to talk about your student growth measures, to talk about your student learning objectives, and to talk about your assessments. So instead of the principal having to individually meet with every single staff member by September 30th, they may be meeting with every grade level team and having those discussions. So after you set the goals, after you have the discussion with your principal, after you've done the pre-assessment, you then continue to practice high quality instruction. For us, it was high quality vocabulary instruction and building background knowledge throughout the rest of the year, and you monitor your student progress.
To finish this up, you're going to administer a post-test and collect all of your student results. That needs to be finalized and shared with your building principal by April 30th so they can have it all inputted into the state computer system at the beginning of May. So here are 5 ways that you can develop completely useless SLOs.
Now, why would we put a slide on here like this?
Well, this is to highlight the ideas that what is it that actually takes you to a high quality SLO and not simply reverting back to your standard everyday practice that we've been doing for years and years.
And one of the things that Brian and I really focused on, because we led this process in our district, we kind of kept this hat on of this could be really, really detrimental to our teachers. This could be really, really detrimental to our students. If you think about, if we just are arbitrarily grabbing assessments, monitoring student progress, if I'm a teacher that walks through, or a student that walks through a middle school schedule, I could have an SLO assessment in every single one of my class periods, and I could be losing a ton of instruction. If I'm a teacher and I want to demonstrate growth, I could, revert to archaic practices that aren't best practice to make sure that my kids are demonstrating growth. So our fear and the negative residual impact of this process really guided us to this place where let's drill it down. Let's glean what would be a very useful SLO and what would be considered the what not to do or what would be useless. So Brian's going to share with you then what our kind of top 5 ways to develop a useless SLO would be.
So you probably have had a chance to read the screen already. So let's move on to the next slide, which will show you not only 5 useless ways, but what to do as well. Make certain that you don't work in isolation. This is a great opportunity to break down the barriers between classrooms. Science teachers, talk to the language arts teachers about vocabulary acquisition. Make certain that your biology teachers talk to your physical science teachers to understand good quality instructional methods. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a science guy. I keep using science references. Anyway, develop assessments which will meet the rigor of the course and not simply the same old assessment that you've been using for years and years. I had a science teacher that showed me one of their pre-assessments. It was about calculating the density of an object. That had nothing to do with understanding the concept of density. It was simply divide 2 numbers out. The teacher did not have an understanding if the child was able to use the phrase density appropriately in a sentence or apply it to a scientific principle, simply if they knew how to divide 2 numbers.
Collaboration is just so critical as a part of this process, and we can't stress that enough. And I really do want to reiterate that Mason is in a very unique and fantastic framework and infrastructure to be able to make that happen and develop high-quality assessments that meet the needs and the rigor of your course and your students. These assessments should be looked at as an opportunity to exceed and go beyond the grade level minimum, because I know that's the student population that you have. You have a significant population of students that are advanced or enriched. And so thinking about those students in particular as you think about the grade level expectations and your learning targets there. Again, alignment and the relevance of the assessments. This process is what you make of it. Again, our fear in this process, when we heard lots of horror stories about districts that just literally told their teachers to go to the Ohio Department of Education website, or they printed off the materials and sent them down the hallway and said, develop your assessments and create an SLO, and then we'll talk about student learning or student growth measure. For us, we really felt like this was a unique opportunity where we could make sure that the same types of assessments and the same evidence of student learning that we've always used, we continue to use, but we would have continuity in each one of our 19 buildings. That we would start having that integration and those discussions across content areas within the same content area, but in different buildings. Mason's already set up to do that, so you're in a really good spot to make sure that those assessments are not only aligned, but they're very relevant. So you're not just assessing to assess. We certainly know that's not the bar that you set there. Finally, this piece here of integrating and supporting best practices and existing staples that you have in your learning community. We really worried that as a part of this process to comply, we would comply and we would let go of what we know are the best practices in vocabulary acquisition, vocabulary protocol, and really, that evidence-based piece of assessment for learning. We really wanted to make sure that this process supported and reinvigorated those best practices and didn't rob us of the time and the opportunity to expose our students and staff to those.
What really makes school districts like Worthington and Mason different from other districts is the fact that we've been handed down a piece of legislation that many districts will simply comply with. This is an opportunity for our school districts to have some autonomy over this process and take lemons and make lemonade. We're going to make this into the best possible learning environment for our students and to show the best possible growth for learning and a wonderful evaluation opportunity as well for the teachers.
One quick story here as we talk about this, that autonomy piece being so critical. We had a lot of folks that were really confused and concerned about the student learning objective process. And one of the things that Brian and I talked with them about is that, if I'm a teacher and I have a choice between value added or AYP data determining my student growth or SLO, I want the SLO every day because I have autonomy and I have control over that process. And we explained that we need to be very reverent to the fact that there are many teachers in our district that are not going to have that opportunity. And it played out. It played out exactly as we thought. We had some teachers that were, writing SLOs and having great success. And then we had many teachers that didn't make that mark with their state-generated data, and they had very little autonomy of the process, and they felt like it was very inequitable because they weren't able to demonstrate the type of growth, and their overall rating was affected in a detrimental way because they didn't have autonomy over the process and they weren't able to craft an SLO because they already had the state-generated data. So I think that's important. Okay, so let's talk about vocabulary. It matters. Point blank, it matters, and the research is unambiguous that it matters big time for kids. It matters for our kids that come to us from impoverished homes. It matters for our students that are English language learners. It matters for those kids that are exceeding the grade level benchmark that are going to be able to expand their knowledge and their understanding of unfamiliar text. It matters. So when we talk about this, to an outsider or novice eye, vocabulary just seems like words, right? Well, we know that that's not. We know that vocabulary forms the core of our conscious operation, and the primary pathway that uses a trigger to recall and store information is through vocabulary. It's not just a word, it's a trigger, and it triggers you to background knowledge. So when you hear a word, or you hear a phrase, or you read something, it allows you to access stored information, and it is that process of making what is unfamiliar familiar to you. So that protocol and that acquisition process of building background knowledge is absolutely critical, regardless of whether you're Brian and you teach high school physics, or you're Jamie Lusher and you're teaching middle school language arts. We focused very specifically on the types and the new research surrounding some of that receptive and then what we consider the productive vocabulary. And that receptive vocabulary includes terms and phrases that students recognize and understand, so they can make meaning of that. But then to produce that production piece, vocabulary includes the terms and words that a student uses in their reading, or in their writing, or in their speaking. And we wanted to really make sure that we focused on this in all the documents and the preparation and workshopping we did with our staff, because the truest way to determine whether a child is really building their vocabulary is through their ability to use those words frequently in their speech and to use them frequently in their writing, and that demonstration process being critical. So that's really a key piece and a key feature of our process and of our work. And we also know that as our students transition from learning to read and reading to learn, the way that they learn, and as the text becomes more complex, they gain knowledge through reading, period. And that's a really critical feature in all of our assessment discussions that we had around the SLO process. So one of the things that we did to kind of narrow our focus on vocabulary was to look specifically at what we consider some universal learning targets. You see 2 learning targets on this slide, and these come specifically from our English language arts 11th and 12th grade bands for our curriculum formats. And the learning targets we identified that we felt transcended every grade level, every content, every building, whether I am beginning as a preschooler or I'm ending my career as an AP senior. I can intentionally build my vocabulary through reading, writing, speaking, and listening. We specifically like this because it contextualized what that looked like and where you would build that vocabulary, and it released responsibility to the learner so that we became wordsmiths, so that our first graders that are using fancy Nancy words or juicy words or college talk are proud to share and use with a high frequency those new words they've learned in their writing and in their speaking. They're gaining those words in their reading and their listening as a part of this process, and extending the learning as a part of the speaking and the writing process. The second learning target we identified, again, that came from our 11th and 12th grade curriculum formats for English language arts, was I can independently acquire vocabulary knowledge to understand in reading and listening, and to express meaning in speaking and writing. We know, and research supports, that the words we choose to use determine the amount of money we will make in our life and how successful we can be. There's a nexus between the vocabulary acquisition that we have and the background knowledge and lexicon that we carry as adults with the quality of our life. So it's so important that not only do we focus on this and we set the bar high with what vocabulary we expose our students to, but then we also give them opportunities day after day after day to build their background knowledge through reading and listening, and then to express their meaning in their own words and in their writing. This is just an example of the curriculum formats that I've been alluding to. As I said, as a district, Worthington developed and created K-12 new curriculum formats for every content area to be aligned with the new learning standards. So you can see here the blue arrows are pointing to the academic and content vocabulary in green font there. So the content vocabulary, again, as you can see in this particular slide, would be that content-specific vocabulary, or what Isabel Beck would call the Tier 3 vocabulary, and we're going to talk about that here in a second. And the academic vocabulary would be the Tier 2 vocabulary, would be those words or processes that transcend all content areas. So as a part of our process, when we focused on vocabulary, we knew that we had to, reinvigorate those old practices, discuss protocols, but then also come together as a group of learners and revisit our tradition of always focusing on background knowledge. We hired 80 new staff members last year, and we knew with great clarity that we had to really go back to those strategies and building background knowledge around the protocols for good vocabulary instruction. So again, we focused specifically on Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary. Research would say that we teach that content-specific vocabulary, okay? So words like hypotenuse, mitochondria, automatopoeia, bicameral legislation, all of those things. Research would say that we teach those words pretty well, and we do a pretty good job of building background knowledge because we anticipate and we know that students are going to have a difficult time when they encounter those words in our content-specific classes. It's the Tier 2 vocabulary, though, that rich academic vocabulary that's beyond our everyday talk, beyond the talk that our students may hear in their own homes, that require explicit instruction. Words like distinguish, construct, boldly. I always use the story that I was proctoring an ELL assessment, and a student was asked, the question asked him to construct a table. It was a mathematics question. And the child drew a picture of a table with 4 legs. The beautiful thing is the child knew that the word construct was a fancy word to say make or build. But there are multiple meanings of the word table, and he wasn't aware that it was asking him to create a table where he could present facts and mathematical information. So that's just an example of that explicit instruction that needs to occur behind our Tier 2 vocabulary, and a great point of collaboration that, as Brian said, could be happening between a science teacher, an English language arts teacher, a math teacher, so that there's that cohesive and integrative and very relevant opportunity to collaborate. You see 3 books that we have up here on the screen, and these were the 3 books that we provided to our staff. First, we started with the one in the middle. Many of you know Isabel Beck, Bringing Words to Life, and she talks about that robust vocabulary instruction being absolutely critical for all learners, and that is the way that we stretch our kids from the top to the bottom. We brought Lori Wilfong in, and she talked about do this, don't do that, and some very practical ways to integrate vocabulary strategies. It was professionally rewarding for Brian and I because she actually used some of the exemplars that we had created to help our staff as a part of her presentation and a part of her work. And then you see to the far right there, Amy Benjamin and John Crow, and that's where we pulled the receptive and productive vocabulary piece, because we really wanted to make sure that we were safeguarding that vocabulary instruction is not rote memorization or just flashcards. We're not, we're not writing the word and then giving a child 4 spaces and making them look up the definition and put in their own words in a sentence. It's well beyond that. It's making those connections and actualizing the schema that's in their side of their mind and that they own and own alone, to build connections between what is unfamiliar and what is familiar. So those were the 3 kind of anchors we used. What we liked about them is that they're very teacher friendly. Not a lot of theory. There's a lot of good research there, but a lot of practice. A lot of easy to implement, a lot of easy to support this process for our teachers. And it really kind of was a nice access point to reinvigorate where we've been as a district with our protocols and vocabulary instruction. But what was very telling, and Brian and I were surprised by this, is also exposed that there were folks that had forgotten some of those key cornerstones and features of building background knowledge and those protocols that we've all used, Marzano's and Rosemary Taylor and Diane Heacock's, all of that information. They had forgot about some of that. So this was a really critical piece, but these were the 3 books that we used and provided to our teachers. One of the things that we created as a resource, we created not only a blueprint for developing the assessment, to walk folks through actually how you might create that common formative assessment for vocabulary. But we also provided some exemplars. And we felt that it was very important to honor our teachers' work here, that we were creating an exemplar that would inspire their creativity and not command their uniformity. Certainly there's power in collaboration and consistency, but we wanted our teachers to really own this process, and our job was to support, facilitate, and provide them with what they needed to be able to make this relevant and meaningful for them. We didn't want them jumping through a hoop. So we wanted, to really focus on that. I think a couple of things that we did too was to try to rely on some of their existing practices, and that exposure and modeling of complex vocabulary being so critical. But the other piece is just building upon what you're already doing as a teacher. One of the examples we gave them was having students circle unknown words in their writing and then the directions or procedures to assess students' current learning. encouraging them to investigate and to be curious about the words that they don't know, and that whole research piece, and really releasing responsibility so that students would actively seek to build their robust and complex vocabulary on a daily and intentional basis.
So we also provided a number of examples of what some high quality vocabulary assessments might look like. This very first one is called a concept sort. It was taken from a high school physical science type of pre and post assessment, where simply you have a list of your terms on the left hand side, and the students were to classify each of these as either chemical property, a physical property, or you can even add that third column of I don't know, or it's neither of these two properties. It really doesn't fit with this term. So knowing non-examples is powerful as well as knowing good positive examples. There's also a way to tier this up to a little more challenging level, which would be an open sort. In this case, you would simply list the terms and have the students create the categories in which to sort the vocabulary into. The next version is what they call a vocabulary word hunt, and that's called a word hunt specifically because of when you're assessing the passage that the student writes, you hunt for the words. We don't particularly like that phrase, but it is a good practice for teachers and for assessing students' understanding of vocabulary. In this example, the student is to write an instructional paragraph to teach a student how to make a light bulb light up. Make certain to use the terms circuit, closed circuit, open circuit, parallel, series circuit, wire, battery, voltage, resistance, and current. If a student could put all of these terms together into a coherent passage that instructed properly how to light up a light bulb, there is no doubt that this student would understand the use of those terms and what each of those concepts actually refer to in an electricity unit, for example. This can also be scaled back by simply reducing the number of vocabulary words in there or increasing those vocabulary words. A concept maze was new to me as a high school teacher, but is very commonly used in primary grade levels. In this passage, what is simply taken is a passage from a piece of text, and then the terms are taken out and two alternatives are offered for each blank. For example, in this case, thermal, heat, and temperature in the very first blank. Student would then have to select one of those three words that most appropriately fits into the passage. This can be very good when you're using terms that are very close together, like thermal, heat, and temperature, and how to differentiate between those in the appropriate context. This can also be moved into what they call a close. And a closed passage is the same exact idea, however, those words are not given in groups of threes for each blank, but in a word bank at the bottom of the passage. You could even scale this up even higher and not have a word bank and have the students come up with the vocabulary on their own that would fit the passage in the context of that sentence.
One thing I want to jump in here on and just show you is that when you look at the maze and you look at the close, you can compare pretty clearly and pretty readily that the maze allows the learner to, or allows the teacher or instructor to isolate the text and by sentence. This is a great way to scaffold. I worked with a teacher who was an intervention specialist, and the class, the general classroom, was doing a closed activity where the text is a body of text. It was very appropriate for the learners and it was rigorous for those kids. Her student, it was really hard for that student to look at that entire body of text and to make meaning of that text and then to apply, obviously, where the vocabulary would be, contextually appropriate. So she did the same content, but used the maze because it allowed her student to isolate the text, and it narrowed the choices so that they were able to scaffold the assessment for that student to still get the same content, to still be looking at unfamiliar text, to be building their knowledge of vocabulary, but by scaffolding the assessment in this small way of isolating the text by sentence and the choices by sentence, it allowed that student to have success and demonstrate growth. When we look at the body of text that we have provided for our participants, when we look at the resources, you see the bibliography here that Brian and I put together.
This shows where we've found those examples or the structure by which to emulate our high-quality vocabulary assessments. These are good examples of where you can go to learn more about creating further high-quality vocabulary instruction. What we showed and shared today is not necessarily the only possibility. It's not to limit you, but to start you thinking into the process of how to increase and make certain that you are appropriately assessing these vocabulary. A little bit back to an example of growth targets. Now, you've given the test, you've done a pre-assessment, and now how do you set your growth targets again? One thing to think about, and this is a little important once you understand what your assessment actually looks like, and that's why we wanted to come back to this, is because students will achieve at a whole bunch of different levels in your pre-assessment. So this is an example for if a student got between a 41 to a 60 on this pre-assessment, whether that's a percentage or that was out of 100 points, then their target score could be set differently than if somebody got a 61 to 80. So in the chart, you can see that it says for the 41 to 60, students that their target would then be 70 points or to increase by 15 points, whichever was greater. And that differs from the 61 to 80 because they want them to get to 85 or to increase by 15 points, whichever is greater. There are a variety of methods to do this. This is just one example. And we show it to you because you do not necessarily want to set the exact same growth target for a kid that got a 91 on your pre-assessment as to a student that got a 41 on your pre-assessment. So there are different ways to make certain that each student has a goal that is achievable but yet rigorous for that particular individual student. Once that all gets compiled down at the end of the assessment, after you've finished your post-assessment, each and every student will be individually evaluated as to did they make the growth target or did they not make the growth target that you set for them. You take the number of students that made the growth target, you divide it by the total number of students that went through the entire evaluation process, and that will yield you that percentage of students that met or exceeded your growth target. In this case, this chart shows you the numerical rating and how it fits back into that nice colorful chart we used at the beginning of the presentation. It should be noted that in Worthington we use the same type of rules about who applies to our teachers as value added did. So if a student did not make the full academic year, their growth, student growth measures did not account to that teacher's evaluation. Or if the student came late or if they were absent, those sorts of things need to be worked out. However, we basically modeled ours after the same way the state does for value added. This evaluation of students making growth is so simple that it actually can fit into a form and can also be put into an Excel document. I'm sure there are many people talented in using Excel that can help you in Mason schools, but the state puts out this template, basically the student name. It has the student number. I'm not sure why the state decided to do that. You do not need to report individual results to the state on SLOs or student growth targets. Then you give them the baseline score, you set your target score, and then final column is basically what you're looking for. Yes, they made growth, or no, they did not make the growth. Bottom left corner shows you that table from the previous slides, and then how many made it, and this is your rating.
So that concludes the content of this session, and certainly this is a process that continues to evolve and unfold. But let's talk now and review kind of where you are now. At the very beginning of this presentation, I asked you to think about where you were on your building your background knowledge. Were you at a place where you know what an SLO is? Would you be able to apply the knowledge that you have? Maybe you were able to create, or maybe you had no idea. We may have given you a lot to think about. You may have more questions now than you have answers, because we've exposed you with just enough information to give you, that beginning background knowledge regarding the process and what that will mean to you and your students. So what I'd like you to do is take a moment and do some self-reflection here. As you can see on the right of the screen, you've got Bloom's taxonomy there of knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, all the way up to creation. So let's talk a little bit, though, about where you are. So if you have an aha, something that you learned, maybe writing that down. A need, what do you need to have happen? Where will you need support? What would you like that process to look like? Be thinking about all of those things, because one of the things that's really clear is that Mason City Schools is committed to ensuring that this is a high quality, intentional, supportive, and collaborative process for teachers. And they want that outcome to be, mutually effective and appropriate and best practice for not only the teachers, but the students. And they want the students gaining as a part of this process and not being impacted in a way that may rob them of instructional time or arbitrarily providing assessments that would meet the requirements of the SLO. So at that point, we'd like to thank you for your participation. We'd like to thank you for your willingness to come forward and learn a little bit more about what continues to be an often frustrating, ambiguous, and unfolding process. But again, Brian and I will do our best to answer any questions that you may have. Please feel free to contact us or any of the folks in your district, as I know that we all are in this together and continuing to support our continued learning about the process and how we can make it most effective and meaningful for you.